Oh, that was pretty. Yo guys, what is up? Max in a Wonderlands video, and today we're updating Volt Viper for Chaos 50. Now this is a Berserker Stabbomancer melee build. It's absurdly strong, and I want to update a lot of my favorite builds for Chaos 50, especially with some new content on the way. We're just going to do a quick one-shot on Son of the Witch just to show you how, like, literally stupid this build is. Make sure he calms down for a second. There it is. So that's the one-shot, and just we are on Intense. And we are on Chaos 50. So yeah, it's just silly how much damage this build puts out. It's great for bossing, good for mobbing, and we actually get some good survivability. Let's break down the build. So we're going to do an overview of the build, and then we'll get into the gear specifics and the skill tree. Now, the most important piece of gear for this build is a class mod that rolls +3 into Icebreaker. Icebreaker is one of the most important skills, or one of the best skills in the game, and it reads that Fate Maker gains increased damage dealt to enemies that are slowed. The closer an enemy is to being fully frozen, the more damage is increased. We're getting, at 6 out of 3, up to 60% more damage against frozen enemies, and then you also want a way to apply the, like, slowed effect or the frozen effect to enemies. I'm using the Empowering Sigil. The Empowering Sigil is in Cryo is a Frost Nova that will insta-freeze enemies. It pulses out, it insta-freezes everything around you. It won't insta-freeze bosses because most bosses can't be frozen, but it will slow them and give us this damage multiplier. Now, the reason this multiplier is so good, we actually have to take a look at the damage formula. Now, stay with me here for a second, but this is the damage formula for melee. And these are all of the different damage increases in the entire game that you can get that will increase the damage of your melee swing. And it's color coordinated by things that are additive with each other, and then the categories are multiplicative with each other. So we've got like melee card damage being multiplicative with consecutive hits melee enchant, and the ideal way to build out our melee damage is by having multipliers in all of these categories so that we're able to increase our damage to the fullest potential. But if we take a look at this, Icebreaker is its own multiplier. It is separate from everything else, and it is a giant damage increase because there's nothing else in the entire game that can give us this multiplier. So by grabbing Icebreaker, we are increasing our damage dramatically, and that is so important. So we want to use a class mod that gives us more points into that, and also we're going to get more points in cryo efficiency so we can freeze things more efficiently, and then when we wind up that melee attack with our full setup, we are going to hit enemies so hard. Now let's go over the rest of the gear. So the weapon that I'm using is a Wailing Banshee. This is the highest possible base damage of any legendary melee weapon, meaning it is going to hit the hardest for us. It's got the Wailing Banshee innate perk on it, which will give us increased ad clear, and I've got Echo on mine, so if I don't kill something with the first swing, I'm going to kill him with the second swing. The Wailing Banshee is, in my opinion, the best in slot weapon for this build. At number 2, the Sultan Battery is absolutely disgusting for killing enemies, and the number 3 weapon is the Spellblade. But I really like the Wailing Banshee is my favorite, and you can farm yourself one. I like using either Shock or Cryo with this setup. If you want to set this build up to be a full Cryo melee build, you can totally do that. I have it set up as like Shock because Volt Viper, but yeah, Shock or Cryo there. Next up, you're going to need a Livewire. Livewire was recently changed. When you are holding the Livewire, when your melee weapon swing connects, you will send out chains of the Livewire on every second melee swing that scale off of the melee damage dealt. So the harder we hit with our Wailing Banshee, the harder the Livewire chains hit, and they're going to deal melee damage. And because this is Shock and this is Shock, I can buff up both by increasing my Shock damage, which is kind of why I'm sticking with one, but you could also go like Shock and Cryo to mix things up. Next up, you're going to want a Twisted Delusion to apply Soaked to bosses. This is just used for bossing, but it's going to give us 50% more lightning and frost damage against enemies. And then any weapon that's got cross bolts that increase your melee damage, you don't like have to use this. As you can see, like we one shot without using it. But if you want to chuck some weapons or shoot some weapons that like proc cross bolts into an enemy, you can then increase your melee damage even further against them. Next up, we're using the Cursed Wit for the 100% increased damage dealt to nearby enemies when our shield is depleted, and we're going to make sure our shield is depleted when we swing on bosses. For our rings, just look for melee damage rings. It's not too particular about what the actual like passive is. Just look for melee damage, melee crit chance, melee crit damage. You really don't need melee crit chance. Melee crit hit damage should be your #1 priority as your secondary slot. For our amulet, I'm using a The Urge. The reason we're using a The Urge is because whenever you cast a spell, you reduce your remaining action skill cooldown by 20%. When we're using the Empowering Sigil, we're actually going to be getting we're able to cast this pretty quickly. This is not as long as a cooldown as like a Buffmeister, for example. And so by using a The Urge, we're able to constantly get our action skill back just by popping our spell, which is really, really nice. And I've got double rolled all damage dealt here. This is absolutely not necessary. In fact, it's additive with our Cursed Wit, which is already giving us 100%. So it's really not all that important to have all damage here, but it is nice. For our class mod, the ideal role is a Corrupted Plate Mail, and I'll explain that in just a second. But once again, we are looking for Icebreaker and Cold Snap as the roles, and that rolls for Berserker Spore Warden. Now, the reason I'm using a Corrupted Plate Mail, I actually kind of discovered this by accident a while back, made a video on it, but this conversion of dark magic basically allows things that have a chance to proc to have 2 chances of procking, and will guarantee our live wire chain, which procs on every second hit, to proc every hit, because we're technically hitting twice every time we hit anything while wearing a Corrupted Plate Mail. So for example, we're increasing our chance of proccing Blast Chill, we're increasing our contagion dots. It's just really, really nice, and it also gives us a ton of survivability just by adding a lot of dark magic damage into our build. And we're going to be chaining dark magic damage with the live wire and the Banshee proc, so it's really, really nice to get a Corrupted Plate Mail here. Next up for our skill tree, the skill tree for Vault Viper hasn't changed. This is the exact same skill tree that I spec'd before, but just a quick rundown. We are focusing on status effect damage in the Stabbomancer tree and melee damage increases. Follow-up is going to give us 60% increased melee damage after we shoot for a little bit, which we can charge up very quickly with the live wire. We're getting more movement speed and more melee attack speed, as well as more status effect damage and multiplicative damage increase with Exploit the Weakness. Exploit the Weakness is really good, and we're pairing it with Contagion to apply more status effects so we can stack Exploit the Weakness against enemies even faster. But we're really in the Stabbomancer tree, and we're really going this deep just for Alchemic Agent, which melee critical hits apply a random status effect. Status effect damage is a percentage of our melee damage dealt, and we're hitting enemies for like 12 million damage. These status effects are going to hit really hard, and if something doesn't insta-die to our melee hit plus the first tick of the dot can build up echo damage for us, which will make our second melee swing hit even harder. So that is really nice, and kind of the goal with the Stabbomancer tree. Note, we don't need Swift Death. This is not a great skill. It's going to give us all damage dealt, and it's additive with the Old Ways and the Cursed Wit, and are all damage dealt. So this really isn't going to give us as much payout as some of the other skills. Next up in the Berserker tree, we're increasing our Frost damage. Now, the reason we're increasing our Frost damage, even though we're like fully basically spec'd for shock damage, is one, because this can be a random dot from Alchemic Agent, so we can boost that. Plus, Blast Chill is going to be always in Frost, so we're increasing the damage of Blast Chill by speccing into this. And by being a Berserker, all of our damage is going to have bonus Frost damage. So even if you're not using a like Frost weapon, Ancestral Frost is still a good pickup, and we've already got a lot of melee damage. If you wanted to put these points in the Old Ways, you could put them into melee damage. The damage reduction here is kind of nice, though. Next up, Icebreaker. Most important skill of the entire build, as I've already explained, and Cold Snap going to give us more movement speed and Frost efficiency. Unarmored Defense is going to increase our health, which is more important to us than our shield, because we're going to be using a lot of dark magic damage. Plus, we've got Blood Frenzy to heal us. This is a lot where a lot of our tankiness comes in, is we've got damage reduction here, Unarmored Defense, Blood Frenzy for more healing, and if we do finally go down, we do get extended time in our Savior Soul mode. So this build is quite tanky. Because of that, you can kind of just sit in damage, and as long as you're swinging on enemies, you should be fine. Blast Chill for the chance to do a crazy amount of damage, and then Iron Squall for more melee attack speed. More melee attack speed, faster dots, bigger dot buildups, more healing for us. It's just really, really nice to have melee attack speed on this setup, and that is it for the skill tree. For our hero points, I put all my points into crit damage for both the crit damage of our melee weapon and our status effects when we're in from the shadows. The rest I'm putting into skill cooldown because I really want to be in from the shadows as often as possible. And we're also using that to proc our enchants, which, by the way, the enchants on this build, you're just going to want to grab as much damage as you possibly can. The ones that I'm using are action skill active, increase elemental damage by 35, all damage dealt, lightning damage, and on action skill start, increase melee damage. The reason I'm not using a while action skill is active, increase damage by 50%, even though it's more damage, is simply because I don't want to have 0 damage when I'm, or only damage when I'm in my action skill. So having some on spellcast ones, if you could change this to on spellcast melee, just having some ones on a lower cooldown is nice to have to upkeep your damage, but you could definitely make this a on action skill active 50% spell lightning damage and do even more damage. But back to my hero stats, skill cooldown, status effect damage, and crit damage. I've got no stabbomancer power, which is kind of a bummer. I'd love to get an amulet with stabbomancer power here so that I could be in from the shadows more, but berserker power is going to increase our bonus frost damage and our blast chill damage, which is just so nice. And guys, that is it for the build video. I will have the save file for this in the Discord. Melee is pretty tough until you get the gear going for it, but once you get the gear, honestly, I think melee is one of the strongest builds in all of Wonderlands. It's just disgusting how fast it kills bosses and clears chaos chambers, and it's really fun. So yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed the build video. Drop a like if you learned anything new, and I'll catch you on the next one, guys. Take care. Peace.